Hello everyone, I hope you're all well. Okay then, so last lesson we were looking at ideology and we're looking at Leninism, and your homework was basically to do that work to find out a bit about Lenin's background. If I remember correctly, we had a little chat, didn't we? Well, I told you about the differences between Lenin's Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, how they both came from the same source, the Revolutionary SD Party, but the Mensheviks sometimes thinking they've been nicer. Yes, they wanted to overthrow the Tsar, but they wanted to work with other groups. They were much more kind of ideas of democracy, working collectively with other groups. Whereas the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, they were much more in favour of a radical revolution. They don't need to work with anybody else. And I think some of the key features of the Bolsheviks and under Lenin was this idea that you radicalise the workers to have this violent uprising, but it's organised by a very tight knit group, a small elite within the party will actually do all the organising, all the sorting it out, etc., etc. There wasn't any kind of belief in democracy. There was definitely no belief in working with other groups. All authority of the Bolshevik Party came from something called the Central Committee, which was led by Lenin and I suppose you would put this way, some of his old cronies, people like Trotsky, people of this nature. He called it democratic centralism. It's a bit kind of a George Orwell type of phrase, but basically it's this small elite who would drive the revolution, drive the decision making of the Bolshevik Party, and decide what would happen. And once Lenin gets into power, once the Tsar, once the provisional government, is kicked out in October 1917, you then have the Russian civil war that takes place. And again, this kind of tight knit group are very much kind of in charge of that. Trotsky's Minister for War, he's got certain responsibilities. You've got Stalin, who was like the secretary of the party. It's all being controlled by this very small elite surrounding Lenin himself. And of course, once he defeats that civil war, that continues. So Russia under Lenin is ruled by a small elite of people in the Bolshevik Party, people like Stalin and Trotsky, Tsarnaev, these sorts of people, who are really kind of running the show. And you might ask yourself, ooh, was that really dissimilar to the Tsars? Because weren't the Tsars basically the Tsar who made all the decisions, and he had some of his top ministers around who kind of assisted him in that process. So you can see there's a similarity there in the reality of these ideologies. I mean, obviously they're quite radically different. Like Mark Leninism comes from the ideas of Karl Marx and the people running the show, and the ideas of the Tsar come from God's kind of their legitimizing factor. But in reality, they're both relying on a very small group, a very small elite who are actually running the show, centered around one person, Lenin stroke the Tsars. So there's a nice similarity there which you can discuss in essays. Now, what we're going to move on to today is just continuing with the Soviet stuff and the communism stuff, and it's basically Stalin and Khrushchev. And it's a bit like what we did with autocracy. Were Stalin and Khrushchev a continuation of the same, or did they offer changes? If they were different to Leninism, were they radically different? Khrushchev, for example, he did this project called de-Stalinization. He did try to move away from Stalin's model, but it's a bit like Alexander II. Alexander II made his reforms to ensure the survival of autocracy. Khrushchev, again, to ensure the survival of Leninism. Khrushchev basically believed that Stalin had deviated from true Marxism and Leninism, and he was going to basically cut out Stalin and go back to what Lenin had tried to do. So, what I'd like to do is in your booklets, there are some questions, if I was trying to find them, on Stalin. And again, I'd use a combination. There's that PowerPoint on Moodle, the very top one, and it is slide 17. No, it's not. What is it? Slide 22 onwards. I think it's 22. Let me just find it. I did write it down. I can't remember what I've done with that. Dun. Where is it? It's on slide something anyway. There's some slides on this Nature Government PowerPoint of Liz about Stalin. What you need to do is use a combination of Access to History book, and it's the book called Access to History, Ideology of the Communists, it's called. Let me get the exact title, and there's no confusion. Access to History for Communism Ideology Task, that's the exact title. And if you look on page 17 to 19 and then 21 to 24, that's the basis of those questions on Stalinism. Liz's PowerPoint, Nature, Government, Ideology, that kind of, it goes along with that reading, I suppose. She's emphasised a few different ideas within there. She's kind of emphasised what it said, essentially. It's slide 20. So slide 19 was about Leninism. Slide 20 got a picture of a young Stalin there. Okay. You got slide 21, which talks a little bit about that as well. A little bit about the tensions as well, because Lenin believed in something called international communism. He believed Russia was the first country and Russia should then encourage other countries to have their revolution. Stalin didn't. Stalin was very much for, let's just build up Russia, essentially, into this great utopian Soviet state. So you've got slide 21 and 22. So use a combination of Access to History and those couple of slides to do those questions. And I think they're relatively straightforward. As I said, in many respects, he's very similar to Lenin, with the idea of, centralised state being run by a small elite, essentially himself. But then he did kind of have something called totalitarianism. It's always a mouthful to say. So you need to find out what that is. And also increasingly this cult of personality as well, which again Lenin was less kind of enamoured to. This idea that Stalin is the great father of the nation, and there's images of Stalin everywhere, Stalin meetings, lots of paintings of like a grandfather Stalin meeting his children. If you went around Moscow in the 1930s, I'm sure you'd find big posters of Stalin everywhere. This idea of the cult of personality, which you might think is that different to the Tsars and previous. I mean, obviously technology had changed, but I suppose under the Tsars they kind of had a little bit of a cult of personality, didn't they? Paintings of the Tsars and the Tsar this and the Tsar that, but definitely was pushed under Stalin. And then on slide 22, she's found two interpretations, one showing that Stalin was similar to Lenin and one showing that Stalin was different to Lenin. Again, have a look at those two interpretations, and again it'll help you to think about similarities and differences between these two rulers, and again it's all just there for your information, I suppose. So once you've done Stalin, you then need to move on to Khrushchev. Stalin dies in 1953. He doesn't leave a successor, and you then have a bit of a power vacuum. If any of you would like to, it's a really good film. There's lots of swear words in this film. Every other word is the F word. It's called The Death of Stalin. It's a comedy. I don't normally like comedies. It's a comedy written by the guy who wrote The Thick of It and those things, called The Death of Stalin. You can get it on DVD. I'm pretty sure you can get it on other means as well. And it's about kind of the death of, well, as the title implies, the death of Stalin and what happened afterwards. So a bit of light relief in the lockdown. If it's going to rain this week, which I believe it's going to, then you might want to watch it. It's a really good film to watch. So have a look at that film. It is quite a good film to watch on this. Anyway, Khrushchev isn't the first. Everyone doesn't think Khrushchev will be the next leader, basically. And they have, when Stalin dies, there's no one really designated heir, so to speak. So you have a collective leadership of some of the key people. So Khrushchev's on there. I said he's not seen as being a potential leader. There's Malenkov, who is kind of seen as Stalin's replacement. There's Molotov, who was Stalin's foreign secretary. There's Beria as well, who's kind of head of the secret police. They had this kind of collective leadership for a while. But eventually Khrushchev kind of emerges. He plays them off against each other, and Khrushchev emerges kind of as the big cheese, so to speak. What he then does, which you might think is a big ideological change, is he has a policy called de-Stalinization. basically, he thinks that Stalin has deviated away from Leninism. Lenin will be turning in his grave. But you can probably see that 'cause he's actually in the mausoleum, isn't he, in Moscow? When I actually went to Moscow, when I was in year 9, so it was it was just before the end of the Soviet Union. You can actually see Lenin's body in Red Square. I think it's still there. It's kind of heavily preserved. I thought it was a waxwork doll. I didn't realise it actually was his body until afterwards. But he's got that many preservatives on him. It probably is a waxwork doll. Anyway, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, so because Khrushchev believes that Stalin had moved away, with all his repression and shooting people every left, right, and centre, and all the rest of it. And so what Khrushchev does, he tries to go back to Leninism in some extent. So some of the horrors of Stalin, some like the terror, is ended. He tries to enter the gulags, these forced labour camps, for example. You saw lots of prisoners being released, all these sorts of things. Images of Stalin are dismantled as well. So his body, for example, was next to Lenin's originally. It's kind of removed. Statues of Stalin are kind of pulled down. That type of stuff. So again, if you look at slides 23 and 24 and 25, they kind of explain a little bit about de-Stalinisation. The questions in your booklet are based on the textbook, the one I mentioned before, Access to History, Communism, Tasks and Ideology. And from doing a combination of those questions, looking at these couple of slides on PowerPoint, you should have this idea of Khrushchev and his kind of ideology. I mean, in many ways, it's a bit like Alexander II. He wanted to reform the nature of Soviet ideology in order for it to survive into the modern world, if you like, by getting rid of the negative effects of Stalin, which again you might say, is that really different to Alexander II? I would say not. Okay, I say they're quite similar in many ways. Both of them were making judicial reforms, or judicious reforms, that's better, judicious reforms in order to continue their party's ideology. Okay, so I want you to do those. What I would then do, I'll put it on the email I send out. I've got like a slide and it's got like some of the things Khrushchev did. And what I would normally do in class is say which of these suggests that Khrushchev was radically different to Stalin and which of these would suggest he wasn't radically different to Stalin. Obviously, we can't do that, but what you could do is perhaps draw up a table. Khrushchev radically different to Stalin, Khrushchev similar to Stalin, and then put these things on the right side, just to help you in your mind come to a decision about how different was Khrushchev to Stalin himself. Okay, once you've done all that, there's a final thing I'd like you to do, and essentially there's a table in your booklet. It mirrors the one you did on Tsars and autocracy. Remember when we did about autocracy, and you basically had the 3 Tsars and you had 3 columns. One was the ruler, and he said what's their main ideas. The next one has similarities between the 3 leaders and what the difference is. It's just the same thing. So you think everything that we've done, everything that we've looked at, feel free to look at other resources as well to add to your knowledge and notes on this. Summarise what's Lenin's key ideas, Stalin's and Khrushchev's. What are the similarities? I mean, just say 3 on the table, but if you want to think of some other ones, then that's fine. What are the similarities between these 3 rulers? Don't say they're all men, in terms of ideology. And what are perhaps the differences between them? So that would probably be Khrushchev versus Stalin, I suspect, and perhaps a little bit Stalin versus Lenin. So what at least 3 similarities between these 3 in terms of ideology, and 3 differences between the 3. Okay, and that should, I think, keep you well entertained until Thursday. So you try and get that done for this Thursday, which is the 30th of April, isn't it? On Thursday, I will then, there's a bit about the structure of government, a bit about local government. Actually, no, that's on structure. Okay, we've basically then finished ideology. What I might do for Thursday is I might tippy-tap out a paragraph for an essay doing the ideology, just so you can see how you do the change in continuity in a paragraph for an essay type of question. I'm not going to set you an essay just yet. That's a bit of a warning, I suppose. And on Thursday, we'll have a chat about the similarities and differences, make sure we're all happy, and then we'll begin to look at the structure of government and again the similarities and differences between them. Any problems, send me an email and I'll try and get back to you. I am involved on tomorrow morning and Wednesday in the interviews I'm involved in some interviews at college. Not for myself, for other people. So I might not be as easy. I might not get back to you quite so quickly. But do send me an email if you do get stuck on stuff, and I will get back to you to assist you. Okay.